It's in Cloud Server. Okay. Right, so you're all here for the presentation where we're going to discuss, sorry about this first slide, it's a little bit bigger than it was meant to be, Tiny Forest in Action. So this particular webinar, which is a new one, discusses how we use the Tiny Forest data. You citizen scientists are out there collecting really valuable information on the Tiny Forest, but obviously it's really important ethically for us at Earthwatch to, one, use the data, and two, tell you how we use that data. So hopefully this presentation will do exactly that. I'm Sophie Cowling. I'm the Tiny Forest Citizen Science Research Manager. I've got a background in a PhD in plant science and environmental data analysis. So data kind of tends to be in my bag. So just to give you a little bit of background on Earthwatch, as we are an environmental data institute, we're established in 1971. For those that don't know about Earthwatch and have kind of joined mid kind of Tiny Forest season, etc. It's an international environmental charity. We've got offices all over the world, but currently I'm presenting from Earthwatch Europe. And it has science at its heart, which is really integral to obviously Tiny Forest and what we do with this information. We drive, as an organisation, we drive the change that's needed to live within our means and balance in nature through connecting with communities. We aim to connect people with the natural world, and through that process of connecting people with the natural world, use them to help us monitor and understand our natural resources and how to sustainably manage and improve them, and then return that data back into the scientific sphere to inform the actions that will have the greatest positive impact on the planet in future. So citizen science, what is it? It's a lot of things. This is a big word cloud done from a poll of what citizen science is to people, and you can see some of the big ones. It's science, it's community, it's participation, learning, creativity, engagement, knowledge, motivation, all sorts of important things. And ultimately it's work undertaken by civic educators and scientists. So at Earthwatch, I'm a scientist, and we also work with educators and engagement specialists within the organisation to develop projects with citizen communities to advance scientific knowledge in certain areas by working with them, to foster a broad scientific mentality, and to encourage democratic engagement, so encourage the public to engage on these important topics, which allow people in society to join the debate about complex modern problems and also contribute towards change, which, as individuals in society, there's this thing, what's it, climate anxiety, because people don't feel like they can contribute to these world problems. So citizen science is a way of doing that, and really it does genuinely help to make meaningful change in the long term. So coming back to sort of the data, so let's skip to the end of the Tiny Forest, as it were. So this is what we're talking about here, is what we do with the data that's collected by citizen scientists. So data communication, that's essentially what we're doing, involves the process of collecting data. Brilliant. As you can see, the people on the right here doing a fantastic job, submitting it to the Tiny Forest portal. And then we'll, as a scientist and us within the Tiny Forest team, will do our own sort of data verification and quality control of that data to make sure that it's fit for scientific purpose, because scientific data needs to be rigorous and well collected. So we'll make sure there's no duplications or obvious errors. For example, that somebody's measured a tree and they've not measured it as being 3 meters tall when it's actually like 30 centimeters. Once the data is cleaned down, we'll then do a data analysis depending on what our research questions at hand are, and then we'll communicate that data to the public, but also a broader variety of people. And how we use that data and how we communicate that data from citizen science projects really plays a crucial role in the project's success and the impact that it can have, both on communities but also on a much bigger, wider scale. So how do we communicate our findings? We like to create really clear communication channels. We can do this with communities, but we also do this with other what are known as stakeholders, so people that are really invested in the data that we're collecting. So that might well be schools, it might well be communities, but it could be also scientific researchers, county councils, even sort of the big government policy people. And then we develop appropriate materials and resources to communicate our findings to have the maximum impacts. Provide appropriate sort of projects related orientation. So with the Tiny Forest, we've got a fantastic portal, we've got the webinars, etc. Train people to collect that data appropriately to support our objectives. So we're training you how to collect really good data, so that we have to do minimal data cleaning, so making sure that that data is good quality for us to use in scientific publications. And then what we're talking about here really is how we interactively feed back the information that you've collected within Tiny Forest. And I think Earthwatch is particularly good at things. We excel at it, in fact. Little pun. We then develop, so we will also develop open access publications so that anybody can get hold of this information. We don't want our data in Earthwatch and Tiny Forest to be sort of gate kept. So we want everybody to be able to access it. So you can download your data from the Tiny Forest portal. And also anything we develop from it that is monitoring reports, proper scientific publications. We want people to make sure they have access to that information in future. And to kind of bring that back full circular, then we'll develop community events and workshops to feed this information back, let people have questions, give really valid points. So that's sort of the general overview of how, in general, with citizen science, people will communicate findings. And of course, it's the big question of, well, why do we communicate our data? Well, we have a range of audiences and outcomes that can come from citizen science data. Really, our main audience is the citizen scientist yourself. So those people looking after Tiny Forest, collecting data. We want to foster a sense of ownership. We want to foster a sense of reconnection to nature, improved environmental stewardship, and help educate. And hopefully that sort of investment will, of course, encourage you then to come back and collect more data. You know, so it's almost like a circular positive feedback loop. And we want to communicate it in a way that makes you feel invested and engaged and will come back again and help us pursue these really important environmental problems. Our other audiences and why we want to communicate our data are, to hear some Tiny Foresters, is also we do have within Tiny Forest scientific research collaborations. So we want to communicate our data to progress our research questions, but also help us develop interesting research collaborations with academics, with the government, etc., to explore interesting questions on a biological scale and a social scale. So as you can see on the right here, we've got Professor Moira Burns. She is a lecturer at University of Leicester, and we have a research collaboration with her around Tiny Forest. So she's planting one here. Our information from the Tiny Forest can also be used to influence practitioners. And what I mean by that is, for example, local authorities such as the City of Wolverhampton, you know, various city councils, because most Tiny Forests are on land owned by city councils. But there are also, for example, conservation NGOs, various organisations that will benefit from us communicating how we manage our Tiny Forests, how successful they've been in terms of both growth and how we manage, like growth and data collection and the difference it's making environmentally and socially. And we can then make guidance documents to help support these organisations. So Alex, you were in the last webinar where a lady from the City of Wolverhampton Council was there, and she was inquiring about our Tiny Forests and helping guide them, implement them in Wolverhampton effectively. So that's what we're talking here about, producing practitioner guidance, is supporting others to follow this effectively. And finally, it seems like a strange one, but ultimately all of our Tiny Forests, as we are a non-profit organisation, we really rely on partners to purchase, as it were, a Tiny Forest and support their planting and the science days. But we also have really big investors that are interested in giving Earthwatch Europe money. So we have this organisation called BlackRock. They're very interested in how much carbon Tiny Forest sequesters. So I'm meeting with them in September to explain carbon sequestration in forests and to communicate our data from Tiny Forests as to the impact that can have. So that can provide us more money as an organisation to have greater impact in communities and science. And also our data can then also be used for what is called research councils. So research councils is when we'll put in a grant saying, for example, we want to do this in our tiny forest, will you give us some money? And we put in these applications to research councils, and communicating our data effectively will help us again win grants to support tiny forest research and planting and projects. But also really importantly is policymakers. So green infrastructure in urban areas is really important. It's particularly timely. We'd like to use our tiny forest data to have impact with policymakers and their decision-making processes. So for example, at the moment, we're in conversations with Natural England about how we can use citizen science data to support their policy decision-making process. So citizen science is super powerful. You know, at the moment, the Tiny Forest project is very young. It's only coming up to 3 years old. So we haven't got a huge amount of data yet to make strong impact right now, but we really hope we will have in future, because it's a fantastic project that has got lots of living labs all over the country that will provide really useful feedback towards urban greening. But I just want to give examples of how longer term citizen science data has contributed to really big, meaningful change, and why you can, as an individual, play a really important role in making societal change happen. So I used to work for an organisation called Adventure Scientists. They amassed one of the largest and most diverse global micropollution datasets to date. So they worked initially with an academic in Canada, and then they trained volunteers to go all over the world as part of their adventures and collect really important data sets. So you can see on the left here what a difference they made. And this information is being used by businesses and governments. It's produced 5 research papers, and it's a data set that is there for people and can be built upon in future. So that's a really amazing resource that's impacting everywhere from research to government. We've also in the UK, just bear with me, sorry. So in the UK, we have recently, there's been a report published on the economic value of the UK's individual trees. So this was a project developed between DEFRA and Forest Research, which are both big government organisations, that quantified the value of urban trees and hopefully will encourage the development of a greater number of urban trees in future. But a big part of that data set was made up using citizen science data. So they used the iTree app to quantify the extent of tree canopies within cities. And this from that, they were able to obviously generate information on the positive value of trees in cities, such as sort of pollution and carbon sequestration, etc. So citizen science data is actively being used by the government, and this will help to inform policies such as the green infrastructure framework that is coming into place at the moment. And finally, this is really a big one. So I don't know if you're aware, but the United Nations implemented Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals that will help to develop sort of peace and prosperity at an international level. So the member countries, which is majority of the countries in the world, measure indicators to see how well they are performing against these development goals, such as clean water and sanitation, or hunger, education, etc. And citizen science is increasingly being used to provide data to inform on how well achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is happening. So, and these is produced every year in a report. So Earthwatch is directly related, feeds into one of these. So one of the Earthwatch Europe projects, Freshwater Watch, monitors the status of sort of freshwater pollution. So they measure things like phosphates, nitrates, etc. in the water bodies. In the UK and Europe, because we have a very well implemented water frameworks directive and monitoring process, our Freshwater Watch data is used to gap fill. So maybe some years, because of a lack of government funding, they use our citizen science data to fill gaps, and it's directly comparable. But in places like Zambia, that is so Freshwater Watch is international. In places like Zambia, it's actually the only data that is being used to inform on the quality of fresh water. And when I mean fresh water, it's rivers essentially. And the Freshwater Watch data is directly used to inform against the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is fantastic. So it's looking at this level where citizen science can provide really invaluable information as sort of international objectives. And in some countries, it's used to gap fill. In some countries, because of poor infrastructure, such as in Africa, it's all they can rely on, and Freshwater Watch has been fantastic for this. So in terms of our tiny forests, as I said, the project is just really starting to take off. And we really would like to use your data to explore some really key scientific questions around what benefits urban forests can provide. So we're exploring how tiny forests can mitigate thermal comfort. So that's cooling cities in an increasingly hot environment, as you can recently see from Europe. Trees can be really used to cool cities through shading and evaporative cooling through little holes in the leaves called stomata. Urban forests are also fantastic for mitigating floods. So they take in water through, and we do that through assessing soil characteristics. We obviously are using tiny forests to give biodiversity a home. So we're monitoring the amount of species, such as pollinators and soil-dwelling organisms in our tiny forest. We're measuring and want to understand how much carbon tiny forests sequester. And also what's really important is not just the science, we want to help to improve people's lives. So green spaces are known to be really important for personal welfare. So we conduct social surveys to understand how residents and volunteers feel with their tiny forests being present and if it helps to improve their lives. So how do we do this? How are we communicating the information that you're giving us? At the moment, it's basically reporting based. So we collect the data, you submit your data on the Tiny Forest platform, and then we collect it off there and we'll analyse it. That data is obviously available for you to also download for yourselves if you want. We don't provide sort of immediate feedback. We are looking at that as ways that you can interactively explore your data online. That is plans for the future. But at the moment, there's no way for you to do that. So we have to provide you with a monitoring report at the end of each year. So the 2022 monitoring report came out in January, and that tells you all about the summary of the research themes that I just discussed. Obviously, there's webinars such as this, where we will report to you the science and what our findings are for each year, and these are stored on the YouTube. And Divya will also do this through the newsletters. So as I said, at the moment, we're quite early on, but hopefully over time, as the tiny forests grow, so some of them are 3 years old now, starting to get quite big, we'll hopefully be able to communicate to you some really clear research findings, and try and get you involved in that more. We have plans in the future for both allowing you, the citizen scientists, to get more involved with the data, and potentially some volunteers for exploring it. And we don't just communicate that data to yourselves. As I said, we will communicate it to a range of people that can have really meaningful impact on a kind of more high, far-reaching consequences. So we communicate our data from tiny forest to specialist audiences, and we do this through conferences. So on the left is Claire Narroway presenting how we use our tiny forest to communicate scientific literacy and education. We submit scientific publications, again, because our data is quite early stage. We're not submitting hardcore research publications with data findings, but what we are starting to submit is how successful the project has been for social welfare and engagement. So last week, we actually submitted 3 abstracts for scientific journals, and hopefully we'll be publishing some more journal articles soon. And we also have ongoing scientific collaborations with various universities, and we also have what's called a Miyawaki research network, which is this LEARN that I've got mentioned at the bottom. So there you can see Daniel, who's our lead specialist, communicating some of our tiny forest findings. And in that room, there are a range of people from universities, local authorities, and government bodies as well. And this is specific to Miyawaki research style. Miyawaki style forest of which tiny forest is one. So it's a wider question around this planting style and how it can be used in urban spaces. So within tiny forest, we have, of course, we're really hoping that the project is going to go on long term, because we've got this fantastic suite of, at the moment, over 200 forests, which all are essentially living laboratories all over the country that we can explore and treat as a long-term ecological and social experiment. So how are we going to do this, and what are we hoping to do in future? So we want to continue enhancing the way that we engage and educate and empower our citizen scientists, so that one, you'll come back and obviously carry on collecting this really important data, but also empower you to go on and be part of sort of environmental change within yourselves and educate others around you. So we want to see, of course, you coming back and supporting the project, but also helping to support and empower others to make social change. We want to further our science and research collaborations. So, for example, we have some research points we'd like to explore that I'm currently developing a network on modelling how much carbon tiny forests actually sequester. That includes into the trees, but also into the soil. And even things such as how do mycorrhizal fungi networks that work in the ground form in tiny forests compared to normal forests, because these are really important networks that help trees grow. We want to be more part of the questions around how do we go about supporting nature recovery and urban nature recovery in the UK. So on the right is a picture from a symposium that I was at earlier in the year. This is called the Nature Recovery Symposium, and it involves practitioners from all over the sector, from Natural England and DEFRA and government agencies, all the way down to sort of local charities and authorities and individuals. And we're trying to be part of these conversations and support particularly urban recovery through these collaborations and research. And of course, through these sort of conversations, we hope to be publishing more, both scientific journals, but also practitioner guidance. So, for example, that might guide local authorities on how they implement their own tiny forests, how we go about planting tiny forests on landfill sites for sort of soil regeneration, etc. And of course, we'd really like to use our information to support some policy changes, you know, which really can have far-reaching consequences. So on the right, you can see, I think it's London, and it's mostly grey. You know, 80% of people now live in cities, and most people don't have access to green infrastructure and green spaces. And there's a government goal to make 40% of residential areas have green or blue infrastructure within that space. So we'd like to be part of those conversations, because tiny forest is a fantastic way to do that. So we're hoping that we can use our information collected from you to inform on government policies such as the Green Infrastructure Framework and Biodiversity Net Gain. Got some really big ambitions, but tiny forest is a fantastic opportunity both for environmental and social change. So that was a lot of information and quite a bit whip through, but thank you for joining, and yeah, let me know if you have any questions.
Oh, thanks so much. That was really interesting. It's really interesting to see about how the tiny forest is actually working with the whole sort of the wider sort of well, the UK, and also all the projects, how it you know, sort of connects people together, and also helps to improve the environment and infrastructure, or the green infrastructure. I was wondering, is there a sort of like a target number of tiny forests you were thinking of putting in sort of in the UK, or is it just as many as possible?
No, we're hoping to hit 500 by 2030.
Wow, that'd be really cool.
Yeah, so we've literally now got tiny forests in, it is mostly in England, and particularly in southern England, but the Welsh government has just put out funding for 100 tiny forests in Wales.
Wow,
so
that's really good.
I think we've only got 4 or 5 in Wales at the moment. So I live in Wales. Mm-hmm. We've currently only got 4 or 5 in Wales at the moment, but yeah, so 100 we're going up in Wales. And each year we keep getting a lot. So I think annually we at 208 forests at the moment, something like that. Yeah,
I think that's right.
Yeah, so we've got a lot, Alex, and we've now got obviously they're increasingly present in Scotland, and we're trying to explore and be a little bit more creative about where and how we place these forests. So I don't know if you've heard of the concept of like green nature corridors.
Oh yeah, I know that. So if you have like two different habitats, you basically put like areas of nature corners between to sort of link them up to sort of deal with things
Yeah.
like combat habitat fragmentation.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. So I knew you'd be on it. I knew you'd understand. But yeah, so we're trying to explore, I think particularly in Edinburgh, they're doing a project of trying to explore placing tiny forests in areas that will help to create habitat corridors and prevent habitat fragmentation. And you might be interested in this as well. There's a project called the long-term ecological frameworks, or long-term ecological experiments, sorry. It's been a long day. Long-term ecological experiments. So there's an actual organisation, which you can have a look at that if you want. It's really interesting, and it's taking these with scientific research. They're usually really short. They're sort of 2 to 3 years worth of grant funding, and it means that we don't get to explore these really kind of big picture whole ecosystem problems. So I think my personal ambition as well is that tiny forests, you have to be 5 years or more with a project. Once we get to 5 years, we can apply for it to be a long-term ecological experiment, and that will help to protect it, and hopefully draw in some more funding as well, so we can kind of really monitor this over like a long period of time.
Right, yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so I can talk about this for ages. So is there anything else you were wondering? I appreciate I've thrown a lot of information.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I think that's the only question I had so far, but it is really interesting, like I said before, to sort of learn in more detail about how the whole sort of tiny forest thing actually works, I would say. I mean,
yeah, I think we talk a lot about the planting and the community engagement, and obviously trying to get you out there collecting the data. But I personally, for me as a scientist, I think, you know, we've got a real ethical obligation to you as citizen scientists to make sure that we use the information that you've kind of painstakingly collected in the best way possible. And like I say, we're doing that mostly at the moment through obviously the way that we communicate it to yourselves, and we have ambitions around making that data more accessible in a way that you can explore it actively. So sort of be able to go online and explore the data yourselves with your platform. We are looking at that, but also, you know, primarily we are developing scientific research collaborations to answer more complex questions around forest function and how it supports urban ecosystems. But also, yeah, we'd really like to explore the role that tiny forests can have in policy and sort of urban, like, biodiversity and regreening. That's our kind of long-term aims.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased to sort of be a space or part of that. It is really fun. It is really exciting and fun also, and also just enjoyable as well to be part of that.
Yeah, I think that's what I was hoping, is to kind of show people, like, I know it might not feel like you're doing a lot as an individual, but when you're doing this collectively, you know, what your data analysis in your tiny forest goes towards a collective of many people, and that can really be used to kind of generate change, you know, and real change.
Yeah, it's really good to be part of that, actually. Also, thank you. It's also really good to sort of learn about how data collection works, also how actually what the actual effects of it are, what it actually does. It is really interesting to learn about that more in detail.
Bro, yeah, okay, I'm glad that was useful. As you know, you can always, I'm going to stop the recording.